I've said for a long time that conditions, immunities, resistances, and vulnerabilities are a huge part of what makes combat in D&D feel exciting and dynamic. Being able to impose different status conditions, find ways to shrug them off, switch up damage types, and find something that works is all extremely fun and interesting to me. I really enjoy those game within the game moments, and I would suspect that many other people do. Without those things, combat just becomes an incredibly straightforward math equation, and as fun as that might be, it just makes the game a little bit less exciting. So today, as part of my ongoing monster analysis series, we're going to be talking about condition immunities. What are the best and worst ones to impose by tier of play, and we're going to be making a tier list for each condition based on its probability to take effect. The criteria for the tier list will be availability of ways to cause the condition, the typical saves targeted, and the immunity rate to that condition. A few notes before we get started. As usual, this took a ridiculous amount of time to put together, especially the class table, so if you'd like to support me by subscribing to the channel and clicking the like button while you're there, that would be extremely helpful. Those small gestures go so much farther than you'd think. Secondly, feats were not included in the class table because it's just not all that interesting of a discussion, since it's just the same for every class, and feats like Fey Touched and Shadow Touched had the potential to create so much bloat that it would just make an already heavy table even more out of hand. And finally, the class table also does not refer to the Eldritch Knight or the Arcane Trickster. Again, largely for bloat reasons. Their tables would just mimic the wizards anyway, just at a much slower rate, so it's not really adding much to the discussion either. Alright, let's get started by taking a look at our condition immunities table. Again, just as we've done in the past, we've broken this down by tier play. This was done by cross-referencing the table in Xanathar's Guide to Everything for a party of 4 to determine which challenge rating creatures you would most likely be coming against in each tier of play. So the tiers are as follows. Tier 1 is levels 1 to 4, which comprises CR 0 through CR 4. Tier 2 is levels 5 through 10, which comprises CRs 5 through 12. Tier 3 is levels 11 to 16, which comprises CRs 13 through 19. And Tier 4 is levels 17 to 20, which comprises CRs 20 through 22. Again, I then also wanted to include the remaining monsters that were higher than CR 22, since there are all that many. This column I've labeled as Tier 5. And it includes all monsters from CR 23 to 30. I should also note that this is, as always, exclusively using content from the 2024 Player's Handbook and 2024 Monster Manual, and multiclassing is just not part of the consideration. Alright, let's get started going through the conditions. We're going to be doing it alphabetically, so we're starting off with Blinded. As it turns out, Blinded is a pretty rare condition to have an immunity to. This makes spells like Blindness, Deafness, or Color Spray more likely to land. The downside here, though, is that they are both Constitution save spells, and actually the vast majority of spells that impose this condition are con saves. The exceptions are Divine Word, which is only available to clerics and is 7th level, Prismatic Spray, another 7th level spell, and Hunger of Hadar, which is just for warlocks and aberrant mind sorcerers. Rogues do get an ability to blind through the Obscure option for Devious Strikes, but even that only comes online at level 14. The Celestial Warlock's Searing Vengeance also only comes online at level 14, and only occurs in pretty niche circumstances. Wild Magic can randomly hit this though, so I guess there's that. Overall, Blinded is a good condition, but remember that this tier list is not about how good the condition is, but rather about how likely it is to land, generally speaking. So even though some of the options come online a bit late and some target some bad saves, we're still going to be putting Blinded into our B tier. Our next condition to look at is Charmed. We can see pretty much immediately that this is looking much more grim as compared to Blinded, especially in tier 4. I mean, good luck. The majority of creatures at that point are just straight up immune to it. Now, the upside here, as compared to Blinded at least, is pretty much all of the effects that impose the charm condition target a wisdom saving throw. In tiers 1 and 2, this actually isn't all that bad. In higher tiers of play though, it becomes awful to target. In fact, in tier 4, it is straight up the worst save to target on average. So that, combined with the fact that 2/3 of the monsters there are immune to the condition, if you're fighting high level creatures, it's not even worth trying. The one thing that Charm does have going for it though, is that there are a ton of different ways that many classes have access to the condition, whether it's through spells or through class features like the Glamour Bard's Beguiling Magic or the Fey Wanderer Ranger's Beguiling Twist. There's also tons of very powerful spells like Charm Person, Hypnotic Pattern, Charm Monster, Geist, and of course the big daddy of them all, Crown of Madness. There's also a few classes like Barbarian Fighters and Monks and Rogues that lack any way to charm at all outside of the aforementioned Eldritch Knight and Arcane Trickster. Please, don't make me say this every time. If I say a fighter or rogue can't do something and the wizard can, know that I understand that these subclasses exist. Cool? Thanks. Anyway, with all that into consideration, I think that Charmed is going to have to fall into C tier. There's tons of ways to do it across many classes, and in early tiers, Wisdom isn't so bad either, so it really just tapers off the longer or the later that a campaign or session is played. Next up is Deafened, which always falls into a weird place for me, since there's not a whole lot of cases where it's mechanically relevant or even detrimental, and even some cases where it could be a situational buff, such as not hearing a harpy song. I've just always found it odd that they codified this and not other things like slowed or the UA dazed condition. Whatever, that's neither here nor there. Anyway, as we can see, other than a small dip in tier 2, an increasingly larger percentage of creatures are immune to the condition as the game progresses. In any case, there's not really a whole lot of ways to impose the condition itself, and it's often just paired with blindness such as in Blindness Deafness and even in Jalarzi's Storm of Radiance. Not to be confused with the 9th level spell, Storm of Vengeance, which can also deafen a target. There's not a ton of ways to impose the condition, and half the classes just can't do it at all. It targets a bad save and requires spellcasting, so for all those reasons, I'm going to drop it into D tier. Our next condition is Exhaustion, and this is an interesting one. Firstly, a high proportion of creatures are immune to the condition, which raises the obvious question of why. The obvious interpretation might be that it's because it's a pretty debilitating one, so the designers wanted to make sure that monsters weren't constantly being wrecked by it, or because players have such easy access to ways to exhaust creatures, or some combination of the two. But that's really not the case. As far as I can tell, so someone please correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure that you will, players have exactly 0 ways to inflict exhaustion on monsters. This again is as far as the 2024 Player's Handbook is concerned. The only way I found outside of this is the 4th level spell Sickening Radiance from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, which is only available to sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards. And even then, it still targets a constitution save. Now, this is still technically available in the context of the 2024 rules, but it is outside the parameters of this video. I think that the real reason so many creatures are immune to exhaustion is just so a DM can use creatures in more narrative ways and explain away the fact that they aren't impacted by the condition. Like saying, yeah, this creature sure has been up for 3 days stalking you, but no, it doesn't suffer exhaustion because. It's also just an easy way to provide plenty of creatures with immunity to the sleep spell, which has been made significantly better in 2024, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Anyway, since it's basically impossible to cause the condition and tons of creatures are immune to it, Exhaustion falls distinctly into F tier. Next up is Frightened, and this one also falls into an interesting place since Frightened and Charmed are very often paired together in much the same way that Blinded and Deafened are. We can see some evidence of this in the fact that it shares nearly identical immunity rates with Charmed with some minor variances. Even in tier 4, we can still see that same massive 67% immunity. Every creature that is immune to Charmed in tier 4 is also immune to Frightened, which makes many of the features and spells that let you choose functionally the same from a probability of landing perspective, which is unfortunate. Anyway, Frightened is one of the most widely accessible conditions to impose across all classes in the game. For the first time, we're even getting Barbarians and Fighters in on the fun with Berserker Barbarians' intimidating presence and the Battlemaster Fighters' menacing attack. Beyond that though, we see some returning friends like Beguiling Magic and Beguiling Twist, but even more features that enable it, like Turn Undead, Abjure Foes, and Frightful Aura. Ultimately, Frightened is going to join its buddy Charmed in C tier, but I think it would slightly edge it out if we were doing that, so like a C+ if you want to. Our next condition is Grappled, which is probably one that a lot of people don't even think of as a status condition, since it's so easily achievable across the game, and grappling is just a basic thing to be able to do. Anyway, a status condition it is. As far as immunity rates go for it, it's pretty low. The problem with grappling though isn't the immunity to it, but rather the fact that it requires the target to make a strength saving throw to avoid it, which is typically among the worst saves to target across all tiers of play. And the DC is based on your strength score, unless you're a monk or have some other ways to adjust the DC for grappling. The reality is though that most classes don't prioritize strength, which means that the already juiced strength saves are probably going to make easy work of the test and not end up grappled anyway. Grasping Vine is also the only spell in the game that grapples, but it's only available to druids and rangers as a 4th level spell, meaning it's functionally only available to druids. Sadly, I think grappling is also going to end up in D tier. Next up is Incapacitated, but before we get too far into the weeds on it, there's one thing that I wanted to mention. Looking at tier 1, we actually have 1% of creatures that are immune to the incapacitated condition. This came as a surprise to me. I didn't think anything in the game was immune to it, and yet, here we are. There's actually even 2 creatures that have the immunity, though technically it's the same one twice, since one is just the swarm version of it. So what is this mighty foe of legend, you ask? Well, it's the all-powerful CR0 Crawling Claw. With an AC of 12 and a monstrous hit point total of 2, you simply don't stand a chance against this guy. Side note, this creature was actually the reason we opted to include CR0 creatures in our analysis this time. Anyway, with that out of the way, it's pretty obvious that Incapacitated is set up for being a total banger condition. Not only is it just really powerful, but outside of exactly one CR0 creature, literally nothing is immune to it. Looking at the different ways to cause the condition, it's clear that most of them come from spells, again with things like Sleep, Tasha's Hideous Laughter, Banishing Smite, etc. Hypnotic Pattern is an interesting one though, since it's essentially a 2-stage check. The way the spell works, it requires the target to be charmed, and then while charmed, it has the incapacitated condition. So for that spell in particular, it's not as obvious as it might initially appear. Also, pretty much every spell that incapacitates targets Wisdom, which isn't too bad, except maybe tier 4, maybe tier 3. Beyond spells though, clerics can incapacitate undead with Turn Undead, and fiend warlocks can do it with Hurl Through Hell at level 14. I think Incapacitated is going to end up being our first S tier condition. Next is Paralyzed, which is obviously a very powerful effect when it lands, but as we can see, it has a pretty high and consistent immunity rate across all tiers of play. And then in tier 5, it just skyrockets. On top of that, there aren't many ways across the classes to paralyze either. There's only 2 spells that can do it, Hold Person and Hold Monster. Hold Person has the obvious downside of being strictly limited to humanoids, and Hold Monster is a 5th level spell, requiring you to be at least level 9 to use it, and it's not even particularly widely accessible, given that like half of the classes that get it are actually only getting it through their subclass. Wisdom, again, isn't all that bad to target though. Paralyzed is going to fall down into D tier though. Moving on to Petrified, there's a high probability that you forgot this one even existed, given that it occurs so rarely in games unless you're routinely fighting basilisks or medusas and things like that. On the player side, the earliest that anyone can even get access to this is level 11 with the 6th level spell Flesh to Stone, and even that is only available to druids, sorcerers, and wizards. Even to suffer the effect from Prismatic Wall requires a ludicrous amount of effort, given that you need to first fail a dexterity saving throw, and then fail 3 more constitution saves, and also have already got through 5 layers of the wall. It's wild. Petrified is going to go down into F tier. Speaking of F tier, let's talk about Poisoned. This condition has just a ludicrously high immunity rate across all tiers of play. It's wild. Nothing else even really comes close. Sure, it doesn't have the crazy 67% spike that we saw with Charmed and Frightened, but each individual tier is just so high. There's a reasonable amount of ways to poison spread across many of the classes though. The most common and easily accessible ways are probably Stinking Cloud or Ray of Sickness. But it is cool to see a few other class features like the Warrior of Mercy Monk's Hand of Harm or the Rogue's Poison option coming from Cunning Strike that are able to inflict the condition, especially since that one only requires sacrificing 1 sneak attack die. The downside though is that it requires both a successful attack and a failed constitution saving throw, and for you to have been in a position to inflict sneak attack damage in the first place. Poison is obviously a very powerful effect, so they are clearly not wanting to allow it to become incredibly easily achieved, and well, I mean they've done that. Like I said earlier, Poison is going to fall all the way down into F tier. From the very bad to the pretty good. Our next condition is Prone, and this is the only one aside from Grappled that every class in the game has a way to impose. I'd say it's definitely the most accessible one, since like we said with Grappled, it was heavily dependent on an ability score modifier that aren't typically relevant. Anyway, as far as immunity rates go, it's kind of middling. Nothing too crazy is going on there, but we just have so many ways to impose the condition, including with weapon mastery spells, class, and subclass features. The saving throws for these are also fairly evenly split among dexterity, wisdom, or strength. Dexterity is only really rough in tier 1, but otherwise it's not that bad, and wisdom is generally pretty okay in the early stages. I think based on a comparison of the immunity rate, accessibility, and targeted saves, Prone is going to fall into A tier. Moving on to Restrained, this one also fares pretty well. With some decently low immunity rates across the board, particularly in tier 3 where literally nothing is immune to it, things are off to a great start. Tier 5 is a bit high, but we're just not going to talk about that. As far as accessibility goes, it's basically only spells, with the exception of the Ancient Paladin's Nature's Wrath, which sadly targets a strength save. Otherwise, we've got spells like Entangle and Snaring Strike and Nivard's Black Tentacles, which also sadly all target strength. At least Web, the best of all the spells here, by far targets dexterity, which is much better on average. Combining all of this together, I think Restrained falls very cleanly into B tier, maybe on the cusp of A. Moving on to Stunned, which is a condition that I've made multiple videos about in the past, since from the player perspective, it's absolutely ruthless. Slightly less so in 2024. Anyway, let's take a look at it going the other way. Things start out looking promising with a 5% or less immunity rate in the first 3 tiers of play, but then things absolutely skyrocket in tier 4 to 42% and are still crazy high in tier 5 at 22%. What's kind of funny about this is that if we look at the class table, there's basically no way outside of being a monk to inflict the stun condition in tiers 1, 2, or 3. Stunning Strike is quite literally your only option, and that even targets a constitution save, which is far from ideal. The only other non-spell way to do this is to be a 17th level Soul Knife Rogue and to use Rend Mind, and at that point, between 22 and 42% of the creatures you're fighting are likely immune to it anyway, so it's like, congratulations, here's this cool feature with a powerful effect, but get wrecked though, because it's not going to work like half the time. Yes, I know that high level parties still have encounters with lower level monsters, but at that point, unless there's an abundance, they're typically more filler creatures and the condition isn't as relevant. A 17th level rogue isn't too concerned about stunning some random tier 1 creatures when they can just kill it instead. Anyway, as far as spells go, we're really only looking at Symbol, Power Word Stun, and Divine Word, and at a minimum, you've got to be level 13 to use some of these. And Paladins do get Staggering Smite, but they still need to wait until level 13 as well. All of this combines to make for a condition that is incredibly hard to have any way to impose, and then even when you can, the target is probably immune or you're targeting a bad save. We're going to put Stun on the low end of C tier. And our final condition to take a look at today is Unconscious. It's basically the worst possible condition to be hit with. It's brutal. Looking at the immunity table though, it has incredibly low immunity rates, even hitting 0% in tier 3, which is wild. It does jump up to 22% in tier 5 though. What's good about this is it actually makes for one of the easier ways to accomplish applying such a potent effect with something like Sleep. This subjects targets to 2 wisdom saves. On the first save, they become incapacitated, but on the second failed save, they fall unconscious. That's a big deal, especially when so few creatures are immune to either incapacitated, except the goat that is the crawling claw, and unconscious condition. Again though, the problem with Sleep is that immunity to exhaustion is fairly common, and those creatures automatically succeed on the spell. So it ends up being something like a 3 level check for them, which is less than ideal. Otherwise though, Eyebite and Symbol are other ways through spells to do it. Admittedly, it's pretty high level though, as is the Rogue's knockout option from Devious Strikes. I think Unconscious will just barely nudge its way into B tier, mostly because of Sleep and because Wisdom isn't awful, most of the time at least, as far as saves to target. I think that the most interesting thing here was just seeing the way that the immunities are applied. It doesn't seem like they just took a look at the most powerful conditions and increased immunity rates for them across the board. In many cases, it actually seems like the most powerful conditions have pretty low immunity. Instead, it seems like they just opted to restrict access to the abilities that can cause those effects, or gated them behind poor saves or multiple checks like we saw with Sleep. Anyway, I hope you had fun with this because I sure did. Let me know what else you're interested in seeing. I've got a bunch of ideas for monster analysis. Big thanks to all of my patrons as usual. Check out some of my other videos, but otherwise, take care.